We now come to the time in our narrative course looking at narrative genre. We're going to look at plot analysis. Now, based on that chart that I gave you at the beginning of the course, we've done a series of analysis, character analysis, setting analysis, scene analysis, and we looked at our significant words. And we're basically going to put all that together. What we've learned all together, we're going to place it all together, and it's going to help us in understanding the plot. And once we really understand the plot of the story, then we can begin to ask questions about the what, why, how. So again, we're not going to deal with the what, why, how specifically in this session, but we're going to give you the framework by which to come up with the what, why, how. And so that's what we call plot analysis. Plot analysis. So what is it? Let me define for you what plot analysis is. Plot analysis, the plot of a story has to do with the process that authors use, those who compose the narrative stories, to develop the subject, the contextual, and the detail matters. So within the plot and the flow of the plot, you can determine the what, why, how. So the authors use this mechanism, the plot, to describe the subject, the contextual matter, and the detail matters that constitute the content of what they want to communicate. They're trying to communicate something. They want to communicate a story that has theological importance, right? That has a theological meaning behind it. And so they write their stories in such a way that, yes, they talk about characters and settings and scenes, but it all leads to an overarching structural way of looking at this in terms of the plot. And so when you think about the plot, it's communicated through a series of scenes that the author uses to tell the story while incorporating details about the characters and the setting. That's why we had to look at those first. We had to look at characters, settings, and scenes before you look at plot. You can't reverse the procedure. You got to look at it in that framework. Otherwise it becomes confusing. You don't really know what you're doing when you're looking at a narrative passage. So basically, we're building off of what we've already learned. We're taking it to the next step, and you want to be aware of that. But even though every story has its own unique plot, in the most part, if you follow these devices that I'm going to present to you, there's these devices that an author will use, a certain set of devices, I call it. So when he's composing his narrative, he follows a pattern. And by following the pattern, this certain pattern, it can help you, the reader, to be able to determine and understand what the purpose of the story is all about. Why the author wrote the story in the first place. What he wants you to learn from it in terms of like the what, the why, and the how. He wants you to grasp that. He doesn't want you to be confused by what he's writing. He wants you to understand it. So he uses these devices, I call it, to help you in determining what that is, help you understand what that is. And I list for you these devices. There's always an opening situation. The story's got to open somewhere. It's got to have a beginning. And so there's always an opening situation. Now the opening situation may refer back to the previous passage, in that came before it, and it may be the result. This event, this narrative story, may be the result of other things happening previous to that. But every story has an opening situation to it, which the author begins to describe. And then there's some kind of problem. A problem will arise. It could be a conflict. It could be something dangerous that's about to happen, or some kind of complication, a question that is posed. It's like there's a problem that's arisen. And then the next device that would be used would be the process. There would be a process that takes place in trying to overcome that problem. Sometimes the author's attempting, or let's say not the author, let's say it's a dialogue between two people, and the one person presents the problem. By their dialogue, that's the problem. And so the other person is trying to solve their problem, trying to deal with the issue. But the person doesn't understand it, so they'll go back and forth, and can be a dialogue regarding that. But what you'll have is there's sometimes a process of trying to overcome that problem. Sometimes it leads to a greater problem. And usually this part of the story will be the longest part in terms of the amount of verses, the amount of words on the page. And then sometimes that process of that problem of trying to overcome it, it leads to a climax. The climax is when the problem reaches its worst. It's not the resolution. It's when the problem reaches its worst, its apex. There's a climax. And then you have a resolution. The resolution is when the problem or the situation is overcome. Sometimes you may have a story where there's no resolution, just the problem and the process of trying to solve it. But normally the next device that would be used in the arsenal of the writer as he composed his narrative would be after the climax, present the resolution, and then there'll be a closing situation. Normally there could be a closing situation. This is the result of what happened. So you have to think about it. Authors are going to use these set of devices, this way of organizing, structuring their narrative story. And you say, well, why can't we start here? Because the story is made up of characters, settings, and scenes, and you need to understand that breakdown first. You need to analyze the stories in terms of that first, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to understand the plot. It's going to be difficult for you to discern the plot and know when the changes come and know how the story develops. You could call the plot the development of the story. And so think about it in terms of these devices. There's an opening situation, a problem, the process of trying to solve the problem, and then it reaches its apex, it reaches its intensive level, and then there's a resolution, and then there's a closing situation. Now, however, not every story has all 6 devices employed and used by every author. You may read a story. Your narrative passage may be there may only be 4 of the 6 that are used. Normally, you got to think of it this way. There's usually always an opening and a closing. Normally. I've seen stories and narrative stories in the scriptures that don't even have a closing, but they definitely, and you got to start somewhere. So there's got to be some kind of opening for something, you know? So usually opening situation, you can guarantee that. There's always got to be a problem or some situation. Something's happening. And so that's usually, we label that the problem, you know, but there's always some situation happening. Now, sometimes there may not be the process of trying to solve it. Then there may be. That one may exist, it may not exist. Sometimes you don't even get to a climax. I've seen where there's a opening situation, there's the problem, and then there's automatically the resolution. And so so not every category or every device is used by every author at every time. An author may use all 6 devices in one passage, but in the next passage, which may be smaller in terms of verses, he only uses 3 or 4 of them. So you can't assume that every device is used in every narrative passage. It's just not the case. And sometimes there's also another unique thing where you have an opening situation, and then you'll go through the process and have a closing situation, but the passage has another opening situation. There's multiple situations. So within multiple situations, you got all the possibilities. Could be double, could be triple. And we're going to talk more about multiple situations in class. Just for imagine right now, though, that your passage represents one situation, not 2. Or 3. Just one situation that has multiple scenes. Not every scene is a situation, okay? Again, don't get confused by that. A story that has one situation can have multiple themes. I'm going to show you an example of that with David and Goliath. That's just one story with one situation. It goes for the whole entire chapter of 1 Samuel 17. But it is just one situation. So right now, don't worry about multiple situations and how that would work. I'm going to explain that in our classroom time and deal with that a little bit more detail in our classroom time. But you have to think about it in terms of those devices being employed. And the reason I want to show you 1 Samuel 17 is because with this story, you see every device used. The author, Samuel, uses every device when he writes this story. It's a very lengthy passage. It's a good example to show you because it actually presents all the devices being used within the story, all 6 of them. And so I want to take you through this story in a way. We're not going to I'm not preaching this to you as a sermon. I kind of want to walk you through some of this. You'll see all of this in your notes and on the website, all these notes that I have. So take a look at that as we go through David and Goliath, the famous story that everybody knows about David and Goliath. So this famous story of David and Goliath, if we want to look at the plot of it, you'll see these devices being used. And take a look at this. We start with the opening situation. Now notice what I've done here. I've labeled the verses that go with that, and I've told you that that's one scene. So verses 1 to 3, if I had done character analysis and setting analysis and scene analysis on that, if I would have showed you all of that, which I haven't done, we would realize that verses 1 to 3 is a scene by itself. And then you got the characters that are in that story. You got the setting and the background of that story. I haven't included all of that material in those examples in our notes and then on the website. But just imagine all that's been done already, and now we're to the point of examining the plot. So I know that there's a scene. I know the breakdown. I know how many scenes there are in this passage, and the first scene goes with the opening situation, verses 1 to 3. So now I'm just describing it. These bullet points here are my way of describing what's happening. The Philistines were gathered for battle. You have a position of the main army, there's a position of the advance army, and I label those places there, Judah, Succoth, and Succoth and Azekah. And then I talk about Israel's king Saul and his men were gathered for battle. Talk about where they're positioned and how they were ready in line. And then I talk about the setting of the battle. See, I would have learned this from my setting analysis. Setting of the battle is Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and it's the valley of Elah that is between them. And at this point, you probably would, as you would have done in setting analysis, you would have looked at a biblical map and seen these places. But again, I'm just summarizing that first opening area, that opening situation device, what I found in those 3 verses. And that's one scene. So, when I find that, then I notice that there's the problem. The problem is in verses 4 to 11, and that's actually just one scene. So, again, is it one device per scene? Not necessarily. It's the way it is right now, but it doesn't have to be. So then, again, look at it. I'm explaining the appearance of Goliath. He's in full army dress. I'm just taking the material from the text. And from what I'd already studied in terms of the characters, I would have already done a character analysis of Goliath. He's a champion from Gath. The height was 9 feet 9 inches. He possessed a helmet of bronze. I mean, this guy's tall and big, and he's armed with a metal coat. It weighed at least 57 kilos, about 126 pounds. He has bronze armor on his leg. I mean, this is the guy. Now look at his actions. See, I describe his actions. He says, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? So what I'm giving you is, and the parentheses shows what's in the text. The interpretation is, are you people crazy? Do you not know that I'm more powerful than your king, than your people? That's if Goliath was talking in today's terminology. So what am I doing? I'm talking about the actions and things that he's saying and doing. And so then at the end of this section, Saul and his army are fearful and dismayed. So there's your problem. You got the appearance of Goliath, and he's promoting himself as being the best that there is. Nobody could kill him. Nobody could match him because of his size, his build. He is the perfect soldier. And he's taunting the people of Israel. Now take a look at the process of trying to overcome the problem. You notice here? Verses 12 to 40. And within that section, there are 7 different scenes. There's 7 different scenes. If you would have seen the scene analysis work for this passage, you would have seen scene 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Scenes 3 through 9 would be under the plot, all put together. Even though they're individual scenes, we have to group them together under this idea of the process of trying to overcome the problem within the structure of the plot. And you can see how I've described this. I've labeled, I'm not going to read all this to you, but I've summarized here. Now, my scene analysis work, there would have been more information there, right? For every scene, I got to give you my the themes that are in that scene. I got to give you my thoughts and emotions within that scene. Again, when I come to the plot analysis, I don't have to rewrite all of that, but I got to take those scenes and summarize it all together. And so when you look at verses 12 to 40, it's basically the process of trying to overcome the problem, and you can see how that develops and what happens there. And that leads to the climax. The climax is that David, he's now in the valley with Goliath, and they're about ready to go at each other. And it's one scene, but it's verses 41 to 47. Remember I told you that the process of trying to solve the problem usually dominates in terms of the amount of material? The climax is just one scene. And again, I'm summarizing that. Goliath is moving closer to David. David responds back to Goliath. And what's the resolution? The resolution is actually 2 scenes by themselves. Verses 48 to 54. Goliath and David move into attack position with David killing Goliath. And then I got details for that. And then the Philistines run away from the battle scene as Saul's army pursues them. Since Goliath is dead, his head's chopped off. Now the army of Saul, nation of Israel, can go after the Philistines. That's the resolution. And what's the closing situation? The closing situation is the final few verses of the chapter. Just one scene. Saul was intrigued with David. He wanted to know the identity of David's father. Saul asked David who was his father. David replied, his father was Jesse from Bethlehem. Why did Saul ask this question to David? You can kind of take a look at chapter 18, verse 4, even though that's not our immediate passage for this one. But that can kind of give you some help. But Saul retains David for himself. David did not return to his father's house, but God had something more important for David to accomplish. He had something important to accomplish, and he was going to do it through David. There's a bigger story here. There's a point to all of this. And when we think about the what, why, how, we're asking those questions. What's the point of this story? What's going on here? You're not able to answer those 3 questions in regards to primary matters until you examine the plot. Until you look at the plot. And when you think about the plot, again, it's not one scene equals one literary device by an author in terms of plot. Don't think 6 devices, 6 scenes. It's not that. There's no formula for this. You could have multiple scenes for one literary device. When you think about the plot, you're thinking the big picture, the big scope of what the author's trying to accomplish, what he wants to communicate from beginning to end, the whole entire story. We've been examining parts of it, characters, setting information, names of cities and towns and places and events that transpire. Then we've been breaking it down into some kind of logical structure called scenes. But the author has put all that together in the formation of what we call a plot. And that plot is what helps you as a reader, especially as an exegete, needing to be able to interpret and preach the passage. It helps you to see that structure. It helps you to see how the author is arranging his work. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to think about these categories, these literary devices. Go back through and look through that 1 Samuel passage And I want you to think through those categories. And we're going to talk more about those categories in class. But that's what I need you to do that as you think about the procedure that you need to follow in order to perform plot analysis on your passage. So when you think about plot analysis, you got to think about the procedure. Here's what you actually do. Here's how it works. Look at what I put here. The procedure for understanding the plot of a story. Number one, you want to determine the number of situations that exist. Determine the number of situations that exist. That's the first thing. I've told you that we're going to talk more about that in the class time. But take a look at the example that I give you from Mark. That's my passage, the one I've been working on. You'll notice there you have all these devices that are used, and you'll see that in the second situation, the process of trying to overcome the problem, there's nothing there. The climax, nothing there. So not every category is used or every literary device is used by the author. But I have multiple situations here. There's 2 situations. And why do I know that? Because I can detect 2 different opening situations. There's a change here. There's 2 different, it's like 2 stories brought into one section. And just go through that. The first situation is from chapter 3, verse 20 to 21, and then there's a break because there's situation number 2. But then we come back to that, kind of that same storyline where verse 31 to 35 kind of completes it out. It's Jesus dealing with his family. The middle section, which is situation number 2, is Jesus dealing with the religious leaders. So there's 2 different situations, and I had to make that determination based on Jesus is not interacting with the same base of characters in all the verses. There's Jesus and his family in one set, and then Jesus and the religious leaders in another set. So I had 2 different situations. So that's an example that you can kind of look at. But notice, within each situation, there's the literary devices. Now, for your passage, you may only have 1 situation, not multiple. So you want to be aware of that. Within each situation, though, once you know what each situation is, even if it's just 1 situation or multiple, you got to determine which of the categories or the literary devices are being used by the narrator. Again, those 6 are, and they'll be done in that order if they appear, but he may not use all of them. And you notice what I did. I listed the category or listed the device, and if it didn't show up, I put none. Something like that. And then I got to put the passage reference that corresponds to each literary device being used, each category. I did that for 1 Samuel 17, David and Goliath. I also do it for the Mark passage as well, as you would see in the example. And then within each category, you got to write a series of statements that describe the events the narrator includes in the story. This is the way you summarize everything. This is the way you can understand it. And I would do it with bullet points, outline points. Do it that way. Don't try to write in paragraph format here. Write in bullet points, because it can help you when you go back. Because after you do this plot analysis assignment, you need that material written in that format so you can better detect what your what, why, how is, and go forward from there. So anyway, that's kind of what you want to do. So do your assignment the best you can. Get started on it. Now, if your passage is a parable, if you have a parable, there's going to be a separate lesson after Primary Matters video in regards to parables. You may have been struggling all this time doing all these assignments because you had a parable. And the final lesson that we're going to talk about before sermon content, there's a thing on parables. That's going to make everything come together for you. So if you're working on a parable, my imagination is, or what I can think is that you're struggling. And that's okay at this point. Do the best you can. It'll all come together. This is still worth time for you to work on these assignments as you can right now. It'll all come together when we talk about parables in a couple sessions from now. But if you have any questions, let me know. But come to class. We're going to talk more about plot analysis, give you some more examples. We're going to answer any questions you have because there may be some confusion. That's okay. But do the best you can to get started looking at your passage and thinking about all that you've learned already, character, setting, and scene, and your significant words, and bring all that together and think through, how does the author flow this passage? How is he writing this passage? How is he composing this passage in terms of the overall plot and scheme by which he's trying to communicate to you what the passage is about, why he put it there, and how he develops it. Okay? So hopefully this has been helpful. See you in class.